Remarks by President Trump targeting Canada, Greenland, and Panama have reignited a conversation about a deeper global trend: the scramble for control over critical infrastructure.
States have used infrastructure, whether called by that term or not, as a way of projecting power for centuries. So just think about Roman Empire and aqueducts, British and their ships, and US and transcontinental railroads. In some ways, you can see US-China competition today as continuation of that age-old story.
From the Panama Canal to Arctic shipping lanes to rare earth corridors, stretching into digital networks, subsea cables, and satellite systems, a new kind of geopolitical contest is unfolding. Why are nations racing to lock down ports, canals, mineral-rich zones, telecom infrastructure, and data networks?
So you've got opportunities to advance your interests if you're a large power building projects at many stages, right? As a financier, as a designer or builder, as an operator. And so there's this sort of range of avenues at which all these stages matter to some degree. The battle for control these days is a little bit less absolute and a little less permanent.
What does this global infrastructure chessboard look like? And where is Washington positioning its pieces?
When we do things like demand things of our partner that go against a treaty that we ourselves have signed, that causes partners to question our reliability in entering into other agreements. Now, this not only undercuts our ability to be a competitor and actually contract with partners, but at the same time, it also takes away an advantage that we have heretofore had over the PRC. And so the degree to which we undermine our perceived advantage of being a reliable, safe partner, that hurts us in the competitive space.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, we explore how control over physical, financial, and digital infrastructure is redrawing the map of international power, and why it matters now more than ever. Joining us today is Dr. Mary Bridges, Jonathan E. Hillman, and Dr. Evan Ellis. Dr. Mary Bridges is an infrastructure expert and Ernest May Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. Jonathan Hillman is Senior Fellow of Geoeconomics at the Council on Foreign Relations, and Dr. Evan Ellis is Research Professor of Latin American Studies at the U.S. Army War College. Moderating the conversation is Courtney Doggart, President of Network 2020.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Network 2020's discussion. We are honored today to welcome three top-notch panelists to Network 2020 to continue what seems to be almost a series of conversations about infrastructure. And today we're going to look at competition for strategic infrastructure. We conceived of this idea based on President Trump's remarks about Greenland, the Panama Canal, and Canada. And assuming that there is more than just bluster to his thinking, we were curious to learn about some of the through lines, which seems to be about access to the infrastructure of today's and tomorrow's economy and economic power. Mary, I would like to start off with you, my favorite place, which is let's lay some groundwork. Could you briefly, if you can, I realize you're a historian, so there's a lot of material to work with. Could you outline the historical quest for infrastructure dominance and how it has shaped global power dynamics? And also, just to make sure we are all on the same page in terms of what we are talking about, what do we mean when we talk about infrastructure?
So a few centuries of history and definitional ground rules. No problem. I'll take the second piece first, just to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. And I think infrastructure is one of those words. I think if you ask four people, you might get four different definitions. To me, it means the complex networks that deliver critical public goods and services. So like clean water, energy, communications, those sorts of things. There's some squishiness or some opacity to the boundaries of infrastructure, which I think is part of what has made it a really useful and politically powerful tool. And that kind of power is actually part of the history of the word. Infrastructure began as a term among French engineers in the late 19th century, and it meant, it didn't mean the tracks of the train. It meant the earthworks below. It was like the culverts and the bridges and the embankments that enabled smooth transit of of the railway. And so it's really the stuff beneath the stuff. And it was an obscure, technical word for a long time until the Cold War. The start of the Cold War, it has a real military context. There were debates about how to rebuild Europe and to prepare against communism. And French negotiators used the term infrastructure to mean not just the bases, but the stuff that made the bases work, like the radio towers and the landing strips and the highways. And so that term, there's no good term in English, even though U.S. negotiators hated how foreign and pretentious it sounded. It was useful. And all of a sudden, by the 50s, it starts being used in English to describe organized crime networks or school systems. And so that kind of porousness of it really is what makes the term become incredibly powerful. So that's the recent history of the term. The states have used infrastructure, whether called by that term or not, as a way of projecting power for centuries. So just think about Roman Empire and aqueducts, British and their ships, and U.S. and transcontinental railroads. And I think, so in some ways, you can see U.S.-China competition today as continuation of that age-old story. One of the features that I think we'll talk about is that there are some distinctive features to the way modern networks interact that makes today's geopolitical competition rather distinctive and worth paying attention on its own terms, in terms of the ways that, you don't just talk about power delivery, or electrical systems, it's electrical systems coupled with, global supply chains and communications networks, and all of those technological systems come together and reinforce each other such that the way these networks operate, and, I think it's one of those things where at a certain point, a difference in size becomes a difference in kind, which has features that I imagine we will continue to untangle in the course of our conversation today.
Okay, great. Thank you for laying that out. John, turning to you, from a geopolitical perspective, how are countries like China and the US approaching infrastructure control today? And how would you kind of compare and contrast that approach?
Yeah, so I'm struck by how China is in many ways following in the footsteps of the great powers that came before it. But also that the infrastructure game has changed in some important ways. So China's flagship initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, was announced in 2013. This is basically Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy vision. And it includes much more than infrastructure, but I think the infrastructure piece is central to it. It's really the carrot for getting a lot of countries to participate in this initiative. It's the spoils for often large Chinese state-owned enterprises. And in many cases, it's kind of the source of the greatest fear about, what exactly is going on here with this global set of activities. And I think what's striking is not just that China is going out, and this vision on its face does sort of look imperial if you look at some of the maps with these sweeping corridors, crossing across continents. But even on a project level, there are some interesting parallels. And so, for example, in Kenya, China has built a rail project literally right alongside a line that was originally built by Imperial Britain. In Southeast Asia, China is arguably following in Japan's footsteps. And in other cases, China's following in the footsteps of the United States. So one of my favorite examples is a port project in Pakistan at Gwadar Port, which at one point in time was the landing site for a British telegraph cable, but then later on was the potential. It almost became a U.S. project, and so the Pakistani government pitched it to the United States. And this is when Henry Kissinger was National Security Advisor. The National Security Council did an assessment of this and said, we think that this is probably not a commercially viable project. It's likely to upset many people in the region, and it's more sort of about catering to some domestic interests. Many of those things still, I think, are true today, but China went ahead and did the project and now has a major stake in Pakistan, that being one of several large projects it's pursuing. So there's lots of parallels, but then the game, I think, has changed in some important ways. In many respects, I think it's more difficult to be an outside power pursuing these large projects in countries, just given that international law and international norms have evolved so much. And so there's much more scrutiny of these projects. And even things that we take for granted, like the fact that you and I have, cameras on our cell phones, leads to more scrutiny of sort of what's going on the ground. As a result, I think the battle for control these days is a little bit less absolute and a little less permanent. And so it's really maybe even more about influence. And so that I kind of think of the game as being maybe more multifaceted even now than it was. And so you've got opportunities to advance your interests if you're a large power building projects at many stages, right? As a financier of projects, as a designer or builder, as an operator. And so there's this sort of range of avenues at which all these stages matter to some degree, but it's less about sort of pure ownership and absolute control over these areas. And so to that extent, I think it's actually become a much more interesting competition.
Just to follow up on that briefly, I mean, it's interesting that you refer to this project in Pakistan that China took on, but Kissinger declined. What you wrote a book on Belt and Road. Excuse me. What do you think that larger objective is? Is it, are these projects that are critical for China? Is it, a means of tying influence? What do you see as the larger objective behind it?
Yeah, I think there's several important incentives. One thing that I didn't mention is that even though China's Belt and Road Initiative has existed now since 2013, there's still no official definition for what qualifies as a project, right? And so even that is sort of an interesting relinquishing of some degree of control. But it's also quite smart in other respects because it allows many different competing interest groups to take whatever they're doing and say, this is part of the Belt and Road. I need government support to help me go pursue this objective. And so, I think it does often depend on the project, but a project like Gwadar in Pakistan, there's a set of commercial interests, the large Chinese state-owned enterprises that have built so much domestically that they've essentially run out of things to build in some cases. This is good business for them. And they don't, to some extent, it doesn't really matter if the project is viable. And then you've got another set of interests that are more on the strategic side of the spectrum, for whom, the PLA and others, for whom access to this part of the world and to have a potential facility in that location is valuable and may be worth paying for.
Thank you for that clarification. Evan, turning to you, zooming in on a particular case, Panama Canal. How does that illustrate the broader competition between the U.S. and China for strategic influence in Latin America?
It illustrates it in many different ways. First of all, it's symbolic to recall that the giving of the concession to Hutchison to the Panama Canal back in 1999 was one of the first major post-war, post-Cold War items of attention to China's presence and the debate about it in the region. But it also illustrates the way in which these questions of strategic infrastructure have both peacetime and wartime meetings. And so, of course, with the peacetime meaning, important to recognize that within our hemisphere, Panama is a global logistics and finance hub. And so a lot of the Trump administration focus on the unacceptability of the idea that you would have influence among the Panamanian government and the families there. And indeed, the question of whether the neutrality treaty signed in 1997 has been breached by that influence illustrates that. But more broadly, also, when we look at the wartime issues, it's, of course, useful to recall that the whole issue of the unacceptability of the closure of the canal, that goes back to the very 1977 treaty itself and the question of setting up exercises like Panamax to rehearse the defense of the canal. And, of course, Secretary of Defense Higgs's visit to the region looking at that. But it illustrates the breadth in a number of different ways. So first of all, when you look at the attention to the Hutchison port operations in Cristobal and Balboa, the broader BlackRock deal, which would have acquired Hutchison ports if it goes through, it actually involves not just those two ports, but it's a reminder that it also involves other strategic ports around the region, such as, for example, a number of ports in Mexico, a number of ports in the Bahamas, and even in Argentina, and of course in other parts of the world as well. But also also the question of the way in which the possible closure of the Panama Canal and why that is militarily significant to strategic infrastructure takes us to a whole network of other critical Chinese infrastructure and questions. And so, for example, in time of war, you would have different U.S. facilities for sustainment and deployment of forces, flowing forces that would go through the Caribbean. And so noticing that there are a number of different Chinese port projects and tourism projects and other infrastructure that would give the Chinese access to that and thus the opportunities to disrupt those flows. Of course, the opportunity to disrupt flows through the Panama Canal, which would be critical to the defense of Taiwan. But then when you look around elsewhere, for example, recognizing that if the Panama Canal itself was interrupted in that transit, that the alternative for U.S. warships would likely be going through the Straits of Magellan or possibly the Drake Passage. And there again, the question of Chinese commercial logistics facilities that received a lot of attention. Literally, the head of U.S. Southern Command, Admiral Halsey, was just there calling attention to that. And then, of course, more broadly, if things went badly, you look at the other side of the continent and the Chinese, the COSCO-operated port of Chiang-Kai, which could be used potentially in time of war to be able to receive and perhaps resupply PRC warships operating in the Caribbean. And then that doesn't even get us to the issue of space. And so you really see the way in which this one infrastructure item from a warfighting standpoint is tied to a range of other different commercial activities, but that have strategic significance. And then just to end, also worth reminding that when we talk about transportation infrastructure, and of course Belt and Road often emphasizes that, but of course you have the digital Silk Road, among other things. And so it's a reminder that the infrastructure, even in Panama, but also elsewhere around the world, when we look at what China is doing, it also involves the question of their dominance of electricity infrastructure, of digital infrastructure, and not solely limited to telecommunications. It involves questions of financial infrastructure, even, all of which are useful points of leverage in peacetime, but also useful opportunities for disruption or espionage in wartime.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that and for making that distinction between peace and wartime. Mary, going back to you, we've talked a lot about this, I think, almost from a government perspective and, in particular, what China's doing. But there are obviously a lot of actors in this space, including powerful private actors. And so what kind of relationship would you like to see between powerful private infrastructure companies and political leaders? And how might a realignment between those groups impact infrastructure, governance, resilience, and global influence?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I think this has come up a little bit in both of the previous answers of the involvement of private sector entities in infrastructure. And I'm going to go historical on this one too. And I think infrastructure inherently involves some kind of mashup of public and private sector operators and power. That's an age-old story. East India Company, dating back centuries, Rockefeller, Standard Oil, the operators of critical systems. In many ways, governments play a central role in kind of creating the space for private sector operation and management, licensing, structuring deals, risk, that kind of thing. And then you need contractors, engineers, maintenance firms to kind of allow those systems to work. And I guess, so I'm originally I'm a historian of U.S. banking overseas, and so in the United States, this really came to the fore when this stuff becomes really clear when systems break. So like the panic of 1907, the United States financial system is on the brink of meltdown, and it takes one person who's sort of the overlord of financial infrastructure, J.P. Morgan, convincing a bunch of bankers to restore trust in the U.S. financial system. And it was very, very clear the power of a single private sector entity over how much control that person had over critical infrastructure, such that it mobilized a political alternative, the creation of the Federal Reserve System, as a way to not cede that much power to a private individual. So I think we can see some of that. I mean, BlackRock is an example of a financial entity to me that operates with some of the same scope and reach and kind of infrastructural power. Its assets under management are so vast. Its assets under management are greater than the combined GDPs of Germany and Japan, which just blows my mind. But not only that, it just came up in Evan's response. It's a port operator. It's building infrastructure. It recently acquired one of the largest infrastructure firms in the world, and it designs the algorithms that other banks use to assess risk. So it's like got hands in all kinds of infrastructure activities. So to me, it's not just about private sector entities controlling the levers of power. It's how that power actually moves through these networks is really decentralized and mediated by other forms of infrastructure, increasingly controlled by algorithms. And I think all of that layering creates really significant problems for democratic governance, for transparency. And I wish I had silver bullet solutions to it. But one of the things that seems really striking is that we very often don't pay attention to the democratic implications, the political implications, until systems break. It takes a natural disaster or a cyber strike or some other kind of crisis for us to realize that we have a real serious governance problem on our hands.
Quick follow-up. Knowing that there's no silver bullet solution, is there any particular area that you're worried about a breakdown in when you're looking across the spectrum?
There are lots of I focus on financial systems a lot. So to me the systems of the dollar moving around the world I don't really of the vocabulary to describe all of the ways in which that system is changing so dramatically. But the conventional ways of dollar supremacy no longer seem to be exactly, this is not an argument that I still believe that the dollar's centrality is going to remain central, but in terms of stable coins, decentralized finance, the way in which those systems operate really have profound implications for who can squeeze, who controls the bottlenecks, and who is best protected when things fall apart. So and given how many other infrastructure systems run through that financial system, that's a core one on my mind.
Thank you. Speaking of unintended consequences, Evan, do you see any unintended strategic consequences to the United States' approach to infrastructure control, particularly in Latin America?
I do. I see many, and of course, I'm talking strictly in my academic capacity and not in my capacity as a government civilian. But I would say, first, it depends on whether you assume that the way something is done in a strategically sound in terms of the consequences or not. And also, which part of the current U.S. pushback towards China do we consider that pushback against infrastructure? So I would emphasize just very quickly what I see is 5 groups of consequences, and then just 3 quick comments. Number one is that to the degree to which we do things that are what I would call strategically meaningless, it gives us the sense that we've taken care of the problem, and in many ways it actually increases the risk. And so, for example, we mentioned before that the Belt and Road Initiative membership really has no clear, legal binding authority. And so the first thing that the Molino government in Panama did when they were trying to assuage the concerns of the Trump administration is they announced they're getting out of Belt and Road. Well, that sounds like a victory, but it actually has not gotten us in legal or material terms anything. Or, for example, a number of our partners have deferred different PRC projects. For example, the BYD plant in Mexico, the Sheinbaum administration has deferred that. And yet that deferral really, again, has not increased the U.S. strategic position. The second area is the degree to which when we do things like demand things of our partner that go against a treaty that we ourselves have signed, in this case, the Panama Neutrality Treaty and the Carter-Torrijos Treaty, that causes partners to question our reliability in entering into other agreements. Now, this not only undercuts our ability to be a competitor and actually contract with partners, but at the same time, it also takes away an advantage that we have heretofore had over the PRC in that, generally Chinese companies are understood as legally somewhat predatory. So a lot of very onerous contracts that you have to watch the fine print for. And so the degree to which we undermined our perceived advantage of being a reliable, safe partner, that hurts us in the competitive space. The third area is that partners, of course, even if silently seek to diversify away to other options. Now, that might be not just be China, but it could be the European Union, et cetera, but that decreases U.S. leverage. And then, of course, fourth, to a certain degree, we do not get everything just from being transactional. To the degree to which we are undercutting the goodwill that our partners have, in the sense that we are on the side of democracy and the relationship is important for non-material reasons. What happens is that when we go to ask, well, please don't go with the Huawei network, or even though we don't have something else to offer you, please don't do the security cooperation. We undercut our partners' willingness to do that for us just because they value the relationship. And then, of course, to the extent to which we actually can provoke political change. And so we have put the Molino government in a very difficult position in Panama, in the degree to which we undercut friends and get something worse. Again, strategically, that can undercut our position. And I'll just very quickly make three other brief notes. Number one, currently a lot of our pushback in the port sector has really been pretty ineffective. And so, the Hutchison deal, as we've seen with BlackRock, actually because of Chinese leverage with the antitrust investigation, may actually be off. Some of the talk about trying to keep the Chinese out of places like Shanghai and the port in Tierra del Fuego have not really had an impact. In the telecom sector, as we've seen, we really haven't had much of a counter offer to be able to put something up there against Huawei's advance, and the degree to which we are undermining our ability to work with other neighbors and partners who have something, such as Ericsson or Nokia. Indirectly, we are taking ourselves farther out of that space. And then finally, financial. The degree to which we, as occurred during the first Trump administration, are using sanctions and even secondary sanctions. There is an indirect cost of the overuse of those financial sanctions, in that, in terms of financial infrastructure, if we are moving the world away from a world that relies on the dollar, we are actually taking away over time our own tools for limiting the danger, or taking away some of our leverage over those partners.
A lot of unintended consequences. Thank you for outlining them so concisely. John, turning back to you, kind of big picture, looking ahead, and Evan and Mary, I'd also welcome your thoughts on this. How should the U.S. prioritize its global infrastructure strategy across areas like critical minerals, the Arctic, and even digital, to remain competitive with, not China, but not just China, but remaining competitive and also resilient in the face of any geopolitical setbacks?
So I'm a fan of play to our strengths, right? And so I think the U.S. has several advantages. Let me just maybe mention a few of them. I think the first is private capital. And so this is just very different, structurally different approach than how China has, in the past 2 decades, supported its infrastructure projects, right? So, the U.S. does have some public money. We've got a U.S. Development Finance Corporation. We used to have a little more foreign aid, but they're not on the scale of, China's main lending vehicles, right? And so, but the U.S. does have a very large and deep capital market. And so there are opportunities using, those vast pools of often savings, insurance money, pension funds, retirement savings, et cetera, to use that money to make investments in projects that are commercially viable, right? I think that is the key distinction, right? They need to be commercially viable. There's opportunities to use public money to de-risk projects and to take projects that are sort of borderline viable and to attract that private money. But to me, that's sort of play the long game, preference projects that are commercially viable over those that are not. There are, of course, exceptions to that rule, right? The U.S. may have a strategic interest in a project and it may be willing to pay, to make it happen, regardless of the sort of commercial dynamic of it. In some respects, even though the BlackRock consortium port deal is a little bit in limbo, it is quite interesting because, at least to my knowledge, does not involve $1 of U.S. government support. It's got lots of other government involvement from the outside, perhaps lots of rhetorical involvement, but financially, this is a really commercially oriented deal, and so I think that is sort of playing the longer game, an area where the U.S. should go. Another advantage is technology. I think even though the U.S. did fall behind on 5G wireless networks, we still have many strengths in the digital arena. And so I would just call out a couple of them. We have got, the world's largest hyperscalers who are investing massive amounts of money, not only domestically, but internationally in data centers, subsea cables. We've got the best companies in the world in many areas of satellite communications and a real head start in low Earth orbit broadband constellations. And so those are first mover advantages that we should press. And there's a lot to offer there. There's a lot of attraction to those offerings from foreign partners. And then maybe the last advantage to mention here is just the network of partners and allies that the U.S. has. China has lots of labels that it likes to put out for elevating certain relationships it has, but dressing those up is not the same as the depth of the alliances that the U.S. has. And several of those close partners are real players in the infrastructure game. So Japan, for instance, still very active in Southeast Asia. Australia, very active in the Pacific Islands. Of course, the EU has its own set of capabilities as well. And I do think that there's been some progress in recent years to try to coordinate those efforts. There's a lot going on now that will distract from that, of course, but there are some pretty notable examples of cooperation, both at sort of a macro level and on an individual project level. Of course, more room for improvement as well. But I would just note those as three advantages: the private capital, technology piece, and then the network of partners and allies. I think that all needs to be part of whatever the U.S. vision is here going forward.
Great, thank you. Two follow-up thoughts to that. One is regarding the subsea cables and the satellite constellations that you mentioned. The previous infrastructure conversation that I mentioned, we did, and if Brian could pop it in the chat, I think that would be great, because we looked specifically at those areas. But I'm also curious to get your thoughts, and maybe Mary and Evan can chime in too, because Evan had mentioned earlier this idea that there hadn't been alternatives to Huawei, and in the U.S., as you mentioned, it's a very different system in terms of these private capital markets that are looking for commercially viable projects. And so what are the advantages and disadvantages that you see, John, and this within the current geopolitical realm with these different systems, where China might be showing up in places for non-commercially viable projects where you would have private capital markets in the U.S. that would be like, I'm not going to touch that. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I think that China's approach, this is true on the digital infrastructure side, as well as some of the other, transport and energy projects. But I think that there's a advantage in terms of speed, to be able to move fast. There's often a cost advantage, which is, I think, to me, that is the biggest factor that often sways foreign decision makers. Is if you can come in with a 30% cost under whatever your actual cost is, that's often quite compelling. There's been an ability to sort of offer a full package, so not just the project itself, but the financing for the project. Got the company that's going to deliver it. We'll provide training to people. We'll even operate it for you if you can't operate it, and a willingness to spend time and attention. This is especially true on the digital infrastructure side, in markets that are quite niche, right, and that may not be getting as much attention from very large commercial players. One of the dynamics here is that as Huawei and other Chinese providers have basically been squeezed out of many of the world's advanced economies, in order to grow, they basically have to double down in these emerging markets. So they are incentivized to spend more time there, to give them more attention. That is their path to growth, to survival in some cases. And so I think the U.S. still does have, again, it sort of depends on the system, the type of infrastructure we're talking about, but in the digital space does have a lot to offer. And I think the sort of the winning argument is often less about who trusts whom and who, it's less about security. It's more about cost and who's going to deliver the benefits that they say they're going to deliver.
Thank you. Yes, Evan.
Yeah, first of all, thoroughly agree with many of John's points. And for me, just to add a couple of the recommendations. First, just to pile on to what John said about partnerships. Oftentimes, it's not just about the technology, but yeah, being willing to work with Ericsson or Nokia or others if there's not a U.S. Solution in the space, but also in terms of the financing of infrastructure, probably the working with the Japanese on the Trans-Pacific Cable Partnership is a great example of that. And so being attentive to the ways in which moving away from partnership in other areas in our foreign policy engagement undermines our ability to be competitive in these collaborative solutions. But also, I think important to be holistic. And so there's a real issue right now, for example, with lithium processing, among other things, where even though we have a certain access to lithium, we're losing our processing capability. And so you have to be attentive to the entire value chain, as the Chinese often are. Also being attentive to standards. So this is an area where, especially with companies such as Huawei, and especially as we move into AI, the ability to lock up those standards and lock in disadvantage is something we have to be very attentive with the Chinese. And another thing that particularly worries me, that again, an unintended consequence of our tariff policies, is the degree to which we're on the one hand trying to encourage investment in infrastructure by friendly nations as a competitor to the Chinese, but at the same time we're trying to say, okay, we're going to create these big tariff walls so that you invest in the United States and not abroad. We are indirectly undercutting our very ability to be able to compete in infrastructure out there through things like the Development Finance Corporation. And then finally, with respect to space, one of the things that is an area that's worried me that we don't talk about enough, although, for example, Elon Musk with Starlink and things like that, we do have a lead. Chinese constellations are even more ambitious than those. I mean, things like Thousand Sails with SpaceSail and others. And so that's an area I think where we particularly have to worry about, Chinese taking away advantages that we currently have and then leaving us at a disadvantage in a strategic area.
Great. Thank you for that. Thank you to the three of you. Really appreciate it. It was a great conversation, and have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.